Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Lifesaver Journal Club. Today we have an interesting article about the role of closed loop communication in CPR, in resuscitation, and we have the honor of having an expert in communication here, Nick, and I asked Nick to introduce himself for the audience.
Thank you, Reza. So my name's Nick Tomlinson and I'm a communication instructor, and I've been working in the field of aviation for quite a few years and focusing particularly on the quality of communication between pilots, air traffic controllers and other staff involved in the daily operation of the aviation world. So I'm very interested to see how CPR is also using CLC, this closed loop communication, and see how to make it effective in this new field. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you so much, Nick. Closed loop communication in CPR. So this study is from the University of Edinburgh, and the title is Closed Loop Communication During Out-of-Hospital Resuscitation. And the question is, are the loops really closed? That's the question this article is trying to address. So the objective is to understand how paramedics communicate during their real resuscitations, and the article is published by the University of Edinburgh, by Marzuki and their team. So as you know, in resuscitation and CPR, every second counts. And before any technique, before any medicine, before any resuscitation technique or machine, communication is the first step. And a single missed word can cost a patient's life. That's why it is very important to focus on communication. And closed loop communication is the standard, golden standard in communication during CPR. And what is a closed loop communication? Here is a simple example of closed loop communication. As you see in closed loop communication or CLC, there are three components. One component is call out, the second one is check back, and the third one is closing the loop. For instance, the speaker one says, John, could you get 20 milliliter of saline solution? And John says, okay, Mark, I'll get 20 milliliter of saline solution. This is call back, and the speaker says thanks and closes the loop. This is a classic example of closed loop communication. So the big question is, if CLC is perfectly working in aviation industry, in military, do paramedics really use it during out-of-hospital cardiac arrest when the chaos, the noise, and the uncertainty just takes over everything? So what they did in terms of the design of the study, the researcher watched 20 real cardiac arrests through paramedics body cameras, and they focused on the first 5 minutes of the resuscitation, which is the most crucial phase of the resuscitation. And every word and every command was recorded and transcribed and analyzed. What they found was the classic call out, check back, and acknowledgement was not used. So only 18 loops out of 676 commands were closed loop, the others were not closed loop, classical closed loop. But the thing is, instead of textbook closed loops, the paramedics used micro loops. And by micro loops, they mean they used quick yes, yeah, a nod, or a visible action replaced the full repetition of the word. So it was not verbal, but it was a kind of visual clue to the sender of the message. So the message was not reiterated verbally, but it was closed somehow by gestures, by quick yes or yeah or nodding and visual clues. So in practice, in resuscitation, there is no time for full sentences. And under pressure, the efficiency replaces the perfection. This is the bottom line of this study. So the thing is, the closed loop communication was not broken. It was evolved. It was evolved into something more practical, more pragmatic. And paramedics build their own form of trust and feedback rather than just what we mentioned in the manual as verbal closed loop communication. So the takeaway of this article is the closed loop communication is still vital, But in real emergency, human adaptability is the most important thing. And maybe the best loop is not closed by words, but it is closed by mutual understanding.
So let's move on to the question session then, Reza.
Sure.
First of all, I wanted to ask you about the CLC, this closed loop communication in the CPR training. How much focus do you place on closed loop communication in the CPR training?
That's a very interesting question. Honestly, in paramedics group of audience, we are very into closed loop communication training and education. But for this CPRC, which is focusing on general public, we don't mention closed loop communication at all. So there is a gap between different courses in CPR when it comes to closed loop communication.
Okay. And do you think that leads to difficulties in the operational field when people are actually busy in the resuscitation process? Is it a problem that people haven't all followed closed loop communication training?
Absolutely. I think closed loop communication is the golden standard, even though it is too good to be true, as the study shows, but it is still the golden standard in communication in CPR. And yeah, people are facing a lot of problems if they don't follow the guidelines. The problem with the non-medical groups who are learning CPR is that when they want to do CPR, they are in a setting that they don't know each other. Imagine we are in a library and someone falls down and we don't know each other and we just know CPR and we just jump to help the person. Because people, they don't have the luxury of knowing each other in advance, they can't do a kind of closed loop communication arrangement, let's say, beforehand. But yeah, definitely it's very crucial.
Okay. One aspect that came up in the study, obviously, was that visual communication is really important. That's a way of checking whether there is understanding or not. Are there any situations in resuscitation where visual communication isn't possible?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Honestly, the classic documents in Red Cross or American Heart Association, they don't mention about the visual communication. The only thing they emphasize is just the verbal communication. I think there is a need to revise that perception, because visual communication is a strong way of communication and definitely it can be applied in CPR as well.
Are there situations, for example, where people are operating in different rooms and they can just hear the voice but they can't actually see the other person? Could that be a case?
Yeah, it's quite possible. And even sometimes because people are focusing on what they are doing, maybe they are not able to look at each other and they cannot make an eye contact and have a visual, send a visual clue to each other. So it's quite possible. Yeah.
So we really need to use a whole range of communication techniques to make sure the message is getting across. Okay, and that brings me to another point, which was that, again, during the paper, they mentioned that some techniques are really useful for getting a good response from the person we're talking to. They said, for example, that if you make a clear request and you give the person's name, they're much more likely to respond quickly to that request. Can you think of any other techniques that you use in the CPR training which are also going to provide a really good response and a really good outcome in terms of communication?
Yeah, I would say that's a great example, like using their own names, because it helps to differentiate, because in a team sometimes something like 10 people are working on a patient, and in that case naming someone with their own name can help a lot. Other ways, maybe using eye contacts if possible. Eye contacts can transfer a lot of information instantly. And the other way is facial expressions. Facial expressions can also be, it's not in the text, but I think facial expression is also a great tool to communicate facial expressions and facial gestures, just to transfer a lot of information instantly.
Absolutely, great. So it's obviously a very intense kind of environment where people are communicating, and we've seen from the paper and from what you've been saying that it's not only verbal communication which is necessary, but body language, eye contact, facial expressions can also be very important to get a clear understanding of what the other person's saying, and crucially to show that we have the same understanding of a particular instruction or a particular need.
Absolutely. And you have years of experience in aviation industry. How did it work non-verbal communication in situations like aviation?
Well, that was why I was asking about the visual communication, because clearly if you're working communication between a pilot and an air traffic controller, they just won't see each other. So it all goes through the voice. And so that's why the communication is so clear and so scripted, you were saying, following precise phraseology, so that the words can be as reliable and as easy to anticipate as possible. So standard phraseology makes a big difference in aviation because everybody knows what to expect, and the message is really unambiguous. So non-verbal communication really doesn't get a look in on the frequency, but clearly in other aspects of aviation, if you're working perhaps with mechanics in the hangar, there could be places there obviously where you're passing tools or you're doing a particular operation, and visual contact, body language will be essential. I think that's a given for a lot of communication situations. But aviation is interesting because you don't have that visual feedback. So you have to make sure that through the clarity of the instruction and from the application of the procedure, we still can get as much shared understanding as possible.
Absolutely, very interesting. And what I was thinking was maybe verbal communication is not only words, it's also tonality as well. For instance, in a CPR circumstance, you may say, call 911, and you mention that in an assertive way. So it is very different that asking someone very in a casual way to call 911. So it's not about the words, it's also about tonality as well.
That's a very interesting point, and clearly a lot of communication happens through the tone of our voice, the manner in which we express that. In aviation, the tendency is to encourage people to focus more on the words because there may be poor quality on the actual communication frequency, and so placing too much emphasis on the tone could be a little bit misleading, simply because of the technical constraints. But maybe in other fields, obviously, people are very receptive to the tone of voice and to other forms of body language. So we mustn't underestimate the power they have to communicate, for sure.
Okay, great. And you have experience in medical communication as well. How do you compare medical communication and aviation communication in general?
Well, I think the big factor for any communication section is time. How much time do we have available? And so there are medical situations where, for example, in the patient-doctor relationship, you have a little bit more time to develop a meaningful exchange, go a little bit deeper. But in a lot of high-pressure situations, there's just not the time to come back to a conversation. You have to get it right first time. So I think time is the crucial element, whether it be in aviation, in medical, or in another field. We have to make sure that we're using the right form of communication for that context.
Very interesting comparison. And back to the conversation about this article, how do we conclude this information altogether?
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen through the paper and through our discussion on CPR is the need to make sure that not only is the message delivered clearly, but there's a clear showing of understanding. The other person really reveals that they have understood what was intended by that first message. The beauty of CLC is that you also get to affirm that that message has been received. So if we wanted to sum it all up, perhaps we could just say we need to have clear understanding that the message has been given and has been understood and will be correctly applied.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your contribution, Nick.
All right, well, it's been a pleasure to meet you today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.